Airport staff calls the cops on a black teen girl, accusing her of suspicious behavior. But when her father arrives, the entire airport is left speechless. The terminal was alive with movement, passengers hurrying to their gates, announcements crackling over the loudspeakers, and the distant hum of suitcase wheels rolling across the polished floors. 16-year-old Aaliyah Carter sat quietly near Gate 23, scrolling through her phone as she waited for her flight. It was her first time traveling alone, and while she felt a mix of excitement and nerves, she had no idea she was being watched. Officer Greg Thompson, a senior airport security officer, stood near the check-in counters, his eyes locked onto her. Something about the girl, sitting alone, relaxed, unbothered, didn't sit right with him. His instincts told him something was off. Maybe she was a runaway. Maybe she was using someone else's ticket. Either way, he wasn't about to let it slide. Without hesitation, he called the police. What happened next shocked the entire airport. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. The murmurs of travelers and the steady rhythm of airport life continued as Officer Greg Thompson lowered his radio, his eyes never leaving Aaliyah. He had just called the airport police, convinced that the black teen girl sitting alone near the boarding gate was up to something. To him, she didn't belong in that section of the airport. He watched as she casually checked her phone, oblivious to the fact that her every movement was being judged. Aaliyah Carter was 16 years old, a bright and confident young girl with deep brown skin, intelligent eyes, and an air of quiet independence. She wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just waiting for her flight like everyone else. Her father had taught her to be strong, to carry herself with dignity, and to never let anyone make her feel small. This was her first solo trip, heading to visit her grandmother, and she was proud of herself for handling it like an adult. She wore a gray hoodie, jeans, and a pair of well-worn sneakers, her backpack resting beside her chair. The airport was a world of its own, filled with people rushing, hugging, saying hurried goodbyes. Gate 23 was no different. Families gathered in clusters. A businessman typed furiously on his laptop. A mother calmed a restless toddler. Flight announcements blared over the speakers, blending into the steady hum of movement. The scent of coffee drifted from a nearby cafe, and every now and then, the squeak of luggage wheels broke the rhythm of airport noise. Aaliyah was used to ignoring crowds. She had been raised in a law enforcement family and knew how to stay calm under pressure. But even with her father's advice ingrained in her mind, she had no idea what was coming. Across the terminal, Officer Greg Thompson stood stiffly, watching Aaliyah like a hawk. In his 20 years of working airport security, he had learned to trust his instincts. And right now, his gut told him something wasn't right. A young black girl, sitting alone, no parents in sight, looking too comfortable in a space where she didn't belong. He didn't need to see anything suspicious, he just felt it. Beside him, another security officer, an older man with graying hair, noticed his fixation on Aaliyah. "Greg, you sure about this? She's just sitting there." Thompson didn't waver. "I know when something's off. She doesn't look like she's waiting for a flight. She looks like she's waiting for trouble." The other officer sighed but didn't argue. He had seen Thompson act on his instincts before. This wasn't the first time. Aaliyah stretched her legs, still unaware of the watchful eyes on her. She glanced at the boarding screen, 40 minutes until her flight. Maybe she should grab a snack. The thought was interrupted as she felt an odd shift in the air, the way someone can tell they're being watched. When she looked up, her stomach tightened. Officer Thompson was walking straight toward her. Aaliyah's body tensed as Officer Greg Thompson approached, his polished boots clicking sharply against the terminal floor. The shift in the air was unmistakable, a heavy presence pressing down on her, making her stomach tighten. She hadn't done anything wrong, but the way the officer was looking at her sent a wave of unease through her body. His expression wasn't neutral. It was skeptical, as if he had already decided she was guilty of something. Stopping in front of her, Thompson planted his feet firmly, arms crossed. He wasn't just standing there. He was blocking her path, asserting his authority without a word. "Where are you supposed to be?" he asked, his voice carrying the sharpness of someone who wasn't asking a question, but demanding an explanation. Aaliyah blinked, confused. "Excuse me," she said, pulling out one earbud. The surrounding noise of the airport, luggage wheels rolling, voices murmuring, flight announcements crackling overhead, suddenly faded into the background. Thompson's eyes remained locked on hers. "You've been sitting here for a while, looking around, checking your phone. Where are your parents?" Aaliyah sat up straighter, instinctively putting some space between herself and the officer's looming presence. "I'm traveling alone," she replied, her tone measured. "My flight board's in 30 minutes. His gaze darkened with doubt. "Let me see your ticket and ID." She hesitated for half a second before reaching into her bag. There was no point in arguing. She had nothing to hide. As she handed over the documents, she could feel her pulse quickening, not from guilt, but from the feeling of being singled out. Thompson took the ticket and ID, flipping them over more times than necessary, as if expecting to find something wrong. His thumb ran over the edge of the boarding pass, his eyes darting between the card and her face, searching for a reason to escalate the situation. Aaliyah's fingers curled into her hoodie's sleeves, a sharp heat rising in her chest. "Is there a problem?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay calm. Thompson ignored the question. "Who bought this ticket for you?" Aaliyah furrowed her brows. "My dad." A smirk tugged at the corner of Thompson's lips, but it wasn't friendly. It was mocking. "Oh, yeah? And what does Daddy do?" Aaliyah exhaled slowly, holding back the frustration building inside her. "He works in law enforcement." Thompson let out a short, dry chuckle, shaking his head as if she had just told him an obvious lie. "Right," he muttered, handing back the ticket, but he didn't step away. The atmosphere around them had shifted. People were watching now. A businessman nearby frowned but stayed silent, while a woman pulled her purse closer, casting wary glances at the scene. Some passengers whispered among themselves. Others simply stared, their expressions unreadable. The weight of their attention pressed against Aaliyah's skin, making her feel small, exposed, accused. She tried to steady her breath, tried to remind herself that she had done nothing wrong. Then Thompson reached for his radio. "I need airport police at gate 23, he said, as if this was already decided. Aaliyah's stomach clenched. "Wait, why?" she asked, her voice sharper now. Thompson kept his face neutral, but there was something in his eyes that told her he was enjoying this. "Just standard procedure," he said. "We need to verify everything checks out." A few feet away, a man pulled out his phone and started recording. Aaliyah's heartbeat pounded in her ears. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was racial profiling. She had two options: stay silent and let herself be treated like a suspect, or stand up for herself. She chose the second. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I gave you my ID. I gave you my ticket. I've done nothing wrong." Thompson barely reacted. "I didn't say you did." Then why are you calling the police?" Before he could respond, another officer approached. Officer Bradley, dressed in airport police uniform. He was younger, more professional in demeanor, but still carried an air of authority. "What's going on?" Bradley asked, his tone neutral. Thompson gestured toward Aaliyah. "She's been acting suspicious. Traveling alone, no checked bags, unusual behavior. Says her dad got her ticket, but we need verification." Bradley's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he didn't immediately challenge Thompson's judgment. "Miss, do you have someone we can contact to confirm your travel plans?" Aaliyah clenched her fists in her lap, heat rising in her chest. Why was she the one who needed to prove herself? She inhaled sharply before pulling out her phone. "Fine," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "I'll call my dad." Thompson's smirk deepened as if he had expected this. Aaliyah ignored him and dialed. She put the phone to her ear, her fingers tightening around it, her pulse pounding with anger, not fear. The moment the call connected, she took a breath. "Dad," she said, her voice controlled but firm, "I'm at the airport and security is questioning me. They don't believe I have a real ticket." The response on the other end was immediate, sharp, and controlled. "Stay where you are. I'll be there in 5 minutes." Aaliyah gripped the phone tighter, her breath steady. She wasn't scared. She was ready. Aaliyah lowered her phone slowly, gripping it tightly, as Officer Greg Thompson continued to watch her, with the same smug expression. He looked like a man who believed he had won, convinced that she was guilty of something, even though she had done nothing wrong. The tension around her grew heavier. Passengers nearby whispered among themselves, some recording the scene, while others simply watched in silence. The weight of their stares pressed down on her, but Aaliyah refused to shrink. She had done everything right, provided her ID, her ticket, and answered every question, but none of it had been enough. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Stay where you are. I'll be there in 5 minutes." She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay composed. 5 minutes. That was all she had to endure, but with every second stretching painfully long, it felt like an eternity. She noticed Officer Bradley shifting uncomfortably, his uncertainty evident. He wasn't as convinced as Thompson, but he wasn't stepping in either. He was waiting, observing, unwilling to challenge Thompson's judgment just yet. Thompson, on the other hand, showed no hesitation. He took a step closer, reinforcing the invisible line of power between them. "And where exactly does your father work?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt, as if the very idea of her father being in law enforcement was laughable. Aaliyah met his gaze without flinching. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied, keeping her voice even. Thompson chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You expect me to believe your dad is some big-shot officer? Come on, sweetheart, just tell us the truth." Heat flared in Aaliyah's chest, but she held her ground. She had heard this tone before, the condescension, the way people in authority sometimes spoke to those they deemed beneath them. She had grown up watching her father deal with people like this, and she knew one thing for sure. They always underestimated the wrong ones. Before she could respond, the air in the terminal shifted. The subtle hum of airport chatter was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of heavy, purposeful footsteps. A ripple of awareness moved through the crowd as heads turned. The once muted murmur of passengers became quieter, tension thickening like a storm about to break. And then he arrived. William Carter, Chief of Internal Affairs for the FBI. Aaliyah spotted him instantly, and her chest loosened slightly. Her father moved with the controlled confidence of a man who was always in command, his tall frame exuding a presence that couldn't be ignored. His dark suit was crisp, his FBI badge clipped visibly to his belt, the gold lettering catching the overhead lights. His expression was unreadable, but the sharpness in his eyes made it clear that he already understood exactly what was happening. The moment Officer Bradley saw him, his entire posture changed. His face tensed, his stance stiffened, and he instinctively took a step back, suddenly aware that the situation had just escalated far beyond what he had anticipated. But the real reaction came from Thompson. The smugness on Thompson's face vanished. His confidence drained in an instant, replaced by something much closer to fear. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He had no idea who Aaliyah's father was until now, and the weight of his mistake settled on him all at once. William Carter didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked up to his daughter, his sharp gaze locking onto Thompson with an intensity that commanded absolute silence. "I assume you have a very good reason for detaining my daughter," Carter said, his voice dangerously calm. Thompson's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Sir, I was just following protocol." His voice wasn't as firm as before. Carter's eyes didn't leave him. "Protocol?" he repeated, his tone slow, deliberate. "Explain it to me." Thompson hesitated, his brain scrambling for a justification. She was sitting alone, no checked bags. She was acting suspicious. His words sounded weak even to himself. Carter's expression remained unreadable, but the silence he allowed after Thompson's explanation was louder than any accusation. It stretched uncomfortably, making everyone, passengers, staff, even Officer Bradley, hold their breath. "So, let me get this straight," Carter finally said. A teenage girl was waiting for her flight, had a valid ticket and ID, complied with every request, and the conclusion you came to was that she must be a threat. Thompson said nothing. His face paled further. The crowd that had gathered around them watched, captivated. Phones remained raised, cameras capturing every second of this moment. Carter turned to Bradley. "Officer, I expect a full incident report on my desk by tomorrow morning." Bradley straightened up immediately, nodding. "Yes, sir." And then, just as quickly, Carter turned away, ending the conversation. He had made his point. Aaliyah watched as Bradley stood there for a few seconds, then shook his head and walked off, while Thompson still hadn't moved from where he stood, frozen in place, processing the collapse of his own arrogance. As they finally reached the gate, Aaliyah turned to her father, lowering her voice. "What's going to happen to him?" Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted the cuff of his suit and looked straight ahead. "He'll be investigated, probably suspended, maybe worse." He glanced at her. "It won't be swept under the rug. I'll make sure of it." Aaliyah nodded slowly. She knew her father well enough to understand what that meant. Officer Greg Thompson had no idea what was coming. Taking a deep breath, she finally let herself relax. She was about to get on a plane, away from this mess, but she knew that the impact of this moment would stay with her, and it would stay with Thompson for the rest of his life. Aaliyah exhaled deeply as she and her father stepped away from the chaos, nearing the boarding gate. The ordeal was over for her, but she knew it was just beginning for Officer Greg Thompson. Her father had made it clear there would be an investigation, and this incident wouldn't be ignored. She could feel the weight of what had just happened settling in, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The energy in the airport had shifted. Passengers who had been silent before were now whispering, some shaking their heads, others staring at the spot where Thompson had stood just minutes ago. The moment had passed, but its impact remained. They reached the seating area near the gate, and Carter gestured for Aaliyah to sit. She dropped into the chair, adjusting the straps on her backpack, while he remained standing, pulling out his phone. His face was unreadable as he typed something quickly before tucking the phone away. Aaliyah watched him for a moment before speaking. "You're making a report already, aren't you?" Carter glanced at her, his lips pressed into a firm line. "I don't waste time when it comes to accountability." A small smirk tugged at Aaliyah's lips. "No, you don't." For a few moments they sat in silence, letting the moment settle. Then, a soft ping from Carter's phone cut through the quiet. He checked the screen, nodded slightly, then turned to Aaliyah. "Airport security is pulling the footage. Thompson is already being questioned." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow. "That fast?" Her father gave her a knowing look. There are two kinds of people in law enforcement: the ones who act justly and the ones who let their biases dictate their actions. When the second group gets exposed, nobody wants to be caught defending them. She let his words sink in. The way Officer Bradley had hesitated, the way passengers had started recording, the way people reacted only after the truth became undeniable. It all made sense now. Some had ignored what was happening until it was too obvious to dismiss. It made her wonder how many times this had happened before, to people who didn't have a father who could walk in and turn the situation around in minutes. A small group of airline staff passed by, whispering among themselves, throwing glances toward the security checkpoint. The tension in the air was still thick, though the source of it, Thompson, remained out of sight. Aaliyah didn't have to see him to know exactly what was happening. His career was collapsing in real time. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that he was in the right. But now he was just another name being discussed behind closed doors, another officer being investigated for racial profiling. She folded her arms and stared out at the runway through the massive airport windows. The sky was beginning to darken, the faint glow of an approaching sunset, casting long shadows on the floor. "He's not going to apologize, is he?" she asked quietly. Carter sighed, shaking his head. "Probably not." It didn't surprise her. People like Thompson rarely admitted when they were wrong. They would rather lose everything than acknowledge their mistakes, and this time he was losing everything. The overhead speaker crackled, followed by a formal announcement. "Officer Greg Thompson, please report to your supervisor's office immediately." Aaliyah exchanged a glance with her father. "There it is," Carter said, his voice calm but final. Aaliyah didn't turn around, didn't look to see if Thompson was still in the terminal. It didn't matter. He wasn't the one in control anymore. His authority had been stripped away in a matter of minutes, just as easily as he had tried to take away hers. She should have felt victorious. In some ways, she did. But a heavier feeling settled in her chest, something deeper than just frustration. It was the knowledge that this wasn't just about her. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of her phone. "How many times does this happen to people who don't have an FBI chief as their dad?" she asked softly. Carter's jaw tightened slightly. He knew the answer, and so did she. "Too many," he admitted. Aaliyah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. That was the real problem. She had been lucky. Lucky that her father had power. Lucky that people had been watching. Lucky that someone had recorded the entire thing. But what about the ones who weren't lucky? The ones who didn't have someone to defend them? The ones who were dismissed, ignored, or worse, who never got the chance to prove they had done nothing wrong? She had seen the stories. She had heard the news. Not everyone got to walk away from situations like this. Not everyone had a father who could show up and instantly shift the power dynamic. She let out a slow breath. I know you're handling it, but it's not enough. Carter studied her for a long moment. Then, with a quiet sigh, he sat down beside her. I know, he admitted, but the way we fix it isn't just by punishing people like Thompson. It's by making sure the next person in his position doesn't repeat the same mistakes. Aaliyah turned toward him, her brow furrowed. How? Carter's expression was thoughtful. Policy changes, accountability, bias training that actually matters, calling out injustices when we see them instead of staying silent. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, and making sure the people with power are the ones who deserve it. Aaliyah considered that. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wouldn't erase everything that had happened. But it was a start. She noticed the way passengers were still whispering, some stealing glances at her and her father, their expressions ranging from shock to admiration. She knew this moment would spread beyond this airport. Someone would post the video. People would talk. Arguments would follow. And maybe, just maybe, this would make someone think twice before assuming the worst about a black teenager sitting alone at an airport. Her father checked his watch. Your flight boards in 10 minutes. Aaliyah took a deep breath, stretching slightly. Good. I think I'm ready to leave this place. Carter gave her a small smile, pride flickering in his eyes. You handled yourself well today. Aaliyah smirked. I learned from the best. They stood together, collecting their belongings, and as they walked toward the gate, she stole one last glance at the security checkpoint. Thompson was gone. Just like that, his power had vanished. And for the first time since she had arrived at the airport, Aaliyah felt free. As Aaliyah and her father walked toward the boarding gate, the tension of the past hour slowly faded behind them. The moment had passed, but its impact would last far beyond the walls of this airport. People had seen what happened. People had recorded it. And soon, people would be talking about it. Aaliyah glanced at the crowd one last time. Passengers were still whispering, still exchanging glances, still processing what they had just witnessed. Some looked uncomfortable, as if seeing the truth unfold in real time had shaken their understanding of how things worked. Others looked relieved, perhaps glad that, for once, justice had been served immediately. But what about the next time? What about the people who wouldn't have an FBI chief arriving to correct an injustice? Her father placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You good? He asked. Aaliyah nodded, exhaling. Yeah, she said. And she meant it. As she handed over her ticket and stepped onto the jet bridge, she felt something different this time. She wasn't just leaving for a trip. She was leaving behind a moment that had made people think. Racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the quiet assumptions people make, the quick judgments, the automatic suspicions. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, questioned without reason, and made to feel like they didn't belong. So, what do you think? Do you believe Officer Thompson learned his lesson? Or will it take real change to fix the problem at its core? If this story moved you, share it. Let's talk about it. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real-life inspired stories. See you in the next one.